Hi, I am Denise Morris, Director of Learning Services at Simulations Plus, and welcome to the MIDD Plus presentation on making modeling and simulation an everyday habit in your organization. The views and opinions presented here are those of my own and do not represent advice or guidance on behalf of Simulations Plus. This presentation is informational in nature and designed to give you a few points to think about and consider. This is a figure from a review published in 2022, where the authors represented different divisions within the FDA. The good news is that it highlights the growth and acceptance of MIDD over the last 30 years. However, it also highlights the various tools that can be employed, introducing potential complexities in how we approach model-informed drug development. I like to call this the MIDD conundrum. When we look at all the tools available, how do we make the best use of them? Are they independent? Are they hierarchical? Are they cyclical? Or are they dependent on a lot of different factors? And this is where it is important to look at all the tools at your disposal and try your best to make them fully integrated, yet fungible parts of your everyday practice. So how can you do that? Whenever I'm working with a client, trying to establish the intent or goal of their project, I typically start by asking 4 very important questions. This is a combination of the what, the why, the how, and the when. And oftentimes, if you can answer these questions, it will help you to determine the best approach to use. We will spend the next several minutes going through each of these questions. I would like to point out that I do not consider these hierarchical in any way, and they should simply be a part of your assessment process. We will start with the what, and the what represents what data do you have available. A client or team member might come to you with a clear preference for using one MIDD approach over another. However, determining whether that approach would make sense can be heavily dependent on the data you have available. For example, you are in early discovery, and all you have are a series of chemical structures. What can you do with the data? Perhaps take an artificial intelligence-driven drug discovery approach where you rank order compounds, integrating quantitative structural, activity, or property relationships, along with a software that leverages those in silico outputs to predict an exposure profile. Another example, you are in your IND enabling phase and want to determine your FIH doses. You have some in vitro data available, along with some preclinical in vivo data. You can take a more mechanistic approach to understand the interplay between biopharmaceutic and species-specific physiologically relevant parameters on exposure, or a more empirically driven approach, incorporating allometric scaling with a population PK model. And as a last example, you are in the later stages of clinical drug development and want to either determine dose selection for an upcoming study or use model-informed drug development to inform drug labeling. You can employ PBPK, PopPK, exposure response, or even clinical trial simulation approaches. Of course, some of these approaches would also be dependent on the answers to the other questions we will cover. Another question you should be asking is the why. Why are you even interested in building a model? Is it to predict untested scenarios? to answer questions on formulation optimization, DDI assessment, special populations, pediatric dose selection? All of these questions, and by no means is this an exhaustive list, might impact the approach that you would take. For example, if you want to use a model in an untested scenario, you might want to employ a more mechanistic approach, such as PBPK or quantitative systems pharmacology, which will give you more room for extrapolation outside of your existing space. If it is to answer questions on formulation optimization, you might opt for a traditional IVIVC approach or want to account for more mechanistic absorption modeling, as can be accomplished with a PBPK model. If it is for labeling updates, and you have an existing POP-PK or PKPD model, you might decide to leverage that model to inform labeling. It is in this vein that your modeling efforts become intentional and fit for purpose. And now we will focus on the third question on the list, the how. How will this model be used? Will it be used for regulatory submission, where you might be less risk tolerant due to greater scrutiny? Will it be used in internal decision-making, where you might be more risk tolerant and use whatever tools that are needed to formulate a path moving forward? Or is it simply an exercise in pushing the envelope? That is, thinking outside of the box to challenge our current perceptions on how we can use model-informed drug development to address questions. In this area of innovative approaches, you would be willing to take optimal risk and hope to make a difference or challenge the status quo. Let's spend a few minutes evaluating each of these, starting with regulatory submission. A popular question we get from clients is whether or not we have had success with a particular approach for a regulatory submission. And that is a very valid point. If you plan to use an approach that will have to undergo regulatory scrutiny, then you might want to be more conservative or know the inherent risk you are taking. During my time in drug development, I've seen pharmacometrics analyses go from a novelty or a nice to have to a standard part of a regulatory submission package. As such, I've seen it move to the top of the approaches people employ when trying to address a question that will be submitted to regulators. However, when it comes to other MIDD tools, they are slowly being adopted as well. And in these cases, balancing the pros and the cons becomes a little more pertinent. Let's focus on PBPK as an example. To the left is a graph showing the number of PBPK submissions to the FDA broken down by key areas such as special populations, absorption, drug-drug interaction, etc. It should be noted that the original summary was published covering roughly 9 years and 254 submissions. This updated publication covers a single year and 116 submissions. So the take-home message here is that we see continued increase in regulatory acceptance with respect to PBPK modeling. And in addition, over the last few years, we've also had several guidances published with respect to PBPK or PBBM. As we continue to see more successful submissions and regulatory guidance on implementing PBPK models, one can imagine that over time, PBPK as an MIDD tool will see similar mainstream adoption and higher risk tolerance as pharmacometrics modeling and simulation. We will now shift gears to look at another how, using models to support internal decision-making. If a model is being developed for internal decision-making, you might be willing to be more creative in the approach that you use. Systems pharmacology or toxicology straddles the fence between being predominantly used for internal decision-making versus regulatory submission. In other words, being used as a tool to guide drug development rather than guiding regulatory decision. In an article published by Zinna et al. In 2019, this was described as being actively engaged in the hope hype cycle, where we have the innovation trigger, peak of inflated expectations, trough of disillusionment, slope of enlightenment, and then the plateau of productivity, where the regulatory context and the scientific approach becomes more integrated and mainstream within the broader exercise of regulatory evaluation. It is encouraging to note that there has been an increase in the use of quantitative systems pharmacology in regulatory submissions, as highlighted by these figures from a more recent paper published in 2021. Here, submissions between 2013 and 2020 show a steady increase with the highest number of submissions in 2020. Moreover, from those submissions, you can see that the majority of these systems toxicology or systems pharmacology usage was in the area of the pre-IND or IND stage. One of the goals in this paper, and I quote, was to inform the QSP community of the ranges and types of QSP applications in drug development across disease states and regulatory submission, thus stimulating the QSP community to further advance quantitative systems pharmacology applications in clinical drug development. So in the case of QSP or QST, the how can play a key role in the decision to move forward with this approach, and will more than likely be dependent on the team's risk tolerance. And in such cases, the value added would need to outweigh the risk being taken. Last in the how category is innovation. I love to see people push the envelope and would often encourage it. Why? Because if it does work, and even in some cases where it does not work, these examples or approaches continue to increase our knowledge and can help the broader community gain confidence in using that approach as well. And it is only with proven or validated cases that we can continue to expand on the types of models that will eventually gain mainstream acceptance. One of the MIDD tools that perhaps falls into this category is machine learning or artificial intelligence. Here are just a few abstracts from the most recent ACOP meeting, as well as an upcoming webinar highlighting the utility of machine learning, whether it is integration with PopPK, quantitative systems pharmacology, bioinformatics, or in the area of precision medicine. And I could not end this without mentioning Simulation Plus flagship machine learning software, ADMET Predictor, which quickly and accurately predicts over 175 properties, integrating ADMET modeling with compound design, data analysis, structural activity relationship, and chem informatics capability. All of these examples are exploring new and innovative ways in which we can incorporate machine learning into model-informed drug development. And naturally, over time, as we continue to publish and present innovative methods and results supporting the use of these approaches, the more implementation of machine learning or artificial intelligence approaches become more acceptable and eventually status quo. Last but not least, in the questions you should be asking to inform your MIDD decision-making is the when. When do you need the results by? And I'll keep this one brief. There are some clients that have a 1 to 2 month deadline and want a PopPK or a PKPD, exposure response, PBPK, or even a QSP model, and assume that this is a plausible deadline. There are no hard and fast rules, but typically these types of analyses can take 3+ months, especially when considering data receipt, data set creation, analysis, and reporting. So it is important to set realistic expectations upfront and try as much as possible to account for unexpected circumstances in your timeline. This wraps up a general process that I personally use on a regular basis to inform MIDD approaches within most of my modeling projects. And to wrap up this session, and per the agenda, I will leave you with some tips to make implementation of these questions or model-informed drug development as a whole more successful. We are going to go ahead and call these the 4 C's. It is no surprise that communication is going to be at the top of the list. If one cannot effectively communicate the responses to the what, the why, the how, or the when, then the utility of these as tools to inform decision-making become less effective. So open line of communication from all key stakeholders is extremely important. The next thing to keep in mind is cross-functional continuity or collaboration. One should never model in a silo. Information gained from one phase of drug development should be leveraged in a multi-directional way. One example of this is as simple as continuity of software. There are some companies that have one group using one software, for example, in discovery and DMPK, and another in the clinical stages of drug development, or any combination of this. In these cases, assumptions can be different and information learned might not be seamlessly transferred. So as a recommendation, I always suggest to keep the softwares as transferable as possible. As mentioned earlier, we might have preconceived ideas on what is the best tool to be used to answer a particular question. But in discussions with other team members, we need to be open to weighing all aspects and compromising if necessary. My approach might not be the only approach, and being flexible and embracing alternatives is extremely critical. And last but not least, be creative. Yes, making MIDD an everyday habit most of the time lends itself to weighing the pros and cons and asking the right questions and being intentional. But when time and budget allows, be creative. As said earlier, it is the only way to continue to advance and increase the tools that we can leverage in model-informed drug development. I would like to thank you for your time, and this concludes this session on making modeling and simulation a part of your organization's everyday process. Thank you.